I talk a lot about AngularJS migration. I have a full-day workshop which I give to teach people how to migrate from AngularJS to Angular. I also do a cut-down version of this workshop, an hour long, which I give at meetups, and I even gave it at NGConf this year as well. But every time I give this talk, I get a bunch of people who come to me afterwards, just like I probably would expect a bunch of you to maybe come up to me afterwards and ask me a few questions. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to give a talk not based on the migration itself, but based on the most frequently asked questions I get about migration, and that is the topic of this talk. So welcome to the AngularJS migration FAQ. So who am I? So my name is Asim. Oh. The screen gone? My name is Asim Hussain. On Twitter, I'm Jawake, and I write and teach about Angular at a site called codecraft.tv. I also wrote the book Angular from Theory to Practice, which you can get from my site, angular.codecraft.tv, and it was also funded through Kickstarter, so it's absolutely free, and you can get it from my website, or you can get it from Amazon, or just anywhere else where you'd normally get an ebook. But recently, about a month ago, I also started working for this guy. Oh, sorry, not this guy. I mean this guy. So I work in John Papper's team, and we both work at Microsoft for Microsoft Azure. And what I'm is a cloud developer advocate. So my job is basically to be a conduit from you, the developer community, through to the actual teams in Microsoft Azure. And I have a rule which I live my life by, which is, or one of the rules I live my life by, which is always listen to the no's. Okay, so always listen to the negatives, or give more weighting to the negatives than you would to the positives. And that's because when somebody says yes to you, something like, yes, I love Azure, they could be being honest, or they could just be being polite. Okay, but when someone says no to you, it's usually always because they're honest. So, afterwards, if you see me in a conference and you've got some bad experiences with Azure, or you've heard or you don't want to use Azure or anything negative about Azure, come speak to me. I want to find out. I want to speak to you. I want to find out what your issues are, and I'll feed that right back to the Azure team. But that's it. That's the only thing I want to say about Azure. This topic has got nothing to do with Azure. What this topic has got to do with is AngularJS migration. Now, as I said, I'm not going to cover the full migration path, but I do want to make sure everybody here has at least a basic overview of what is involved in AngularJS migration. So I'm going to teach you the absolute basics of migration in 5 minutes. So just so we're clear with a bunch of terminology, when I say Angular, I mean Angular 4, the latest version of Angular that we have right now. When I say AngularJS, I mean Angular 1. Okay, now I might make a mistake as I go through this talk. I might say Angular 1 and Angular 4, but I mean AngularJS and Angular, okay? Also, I've done this kind of versions of this talk before. Both those logos are kind of red, so to make things super clear for the colorblind people in the audience, if you see something blue, I'm talking about Angular 4. If you see something red, I'm talking about AngularJS, which is a number 1. So, can you see that? Yeah, that's good. So this is just an example application that we do in our workshop, that we migrate from AngularJS to Angular. All these different things are different entities in the application. Some of them might be controllers. Some of them might be directives, some of them might be services, some of them might be resources. But when we're migrating an AngularJS application, what we do is something called dual booting. So we're basically running AngularJS and Angular in the same application at the same time. And the application is then said to be in hybrid mode. Now, the reason we do this is so that then we can run Angular 4, Angular code, Angular entities, side by side with AngularJS. So when in hybrid mode, we can actually have entities in our application that are written in Angular 4, and they can live side by side with stuff that's written in AngularJS. And so the way I teach migration, or my recommended approach for migration, is I call it, you take your AngularJS application and you infect it with Angular. Okay, so you start off at the leaves, so I start at the resource, and you basically rewrite that as Angular 4. And the down arrow is important. The down arrow in this situation means I've downgraded it. So I've rewritten this resource entity as Angular 4, and you call downgrade component. And once you downgrade an Angular 4 component or entity, it can then be used from within an AngularJS entity. And so that's basically what we do. So we've infected resource, and then basically we just go up the tree. So then, because all the dependencies of service in our Angular 4 make sense to upgrade that to Angular 4 as well. And since resource is only being used by something that's Angular, there's no need to downgrade it anymore. But since services needs to be used in all these AngularJS components, we have to downgrade it. And that's basically what you do. You just go through your application, you take an entity by an entity, you rewrite it to Angular 4, but then if it's going to be used in AngularJS, you have to downgrade it, and you keep on doing that. You go up your stack, until eventually you've rewritten everything as Angular 4, and then you jump through a couple more hoops, you drop your AngularJS, and then you have an Angular 4 application running. So you've basically gone through the process of migration. All right? End. Any questions? No, just joking. So that's basically migration in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it than that, but I just want to make sure everybody's got like a basic idea of what's involved. Come on. Okay, so the way I teach this whole process is I have what I call the plan, which is a 10-step plan for how to migrate an Angular application. But we won't be going through that today. Okay, what we're going to go through today is the FAQ, the frequently asked questions. Now, we've only got half an hour today, so I'll only do 3 of the most popular FAQs that we have. So those 3 are, what do I do with all my scope watches? So who here's got an AngularJS application right now? Who here's got a whole bunch of scope watches in their AngularJS application? There you go. What do you do with all of those in your new Angular world? The other question is, and I think this is a really interesting question, which is where are all the third-party Angular modules? Right? In AngularJS land, we just have a whole bunch of third-party modules. Everybody's sitting around and waiting for the same thing to happen in Angular land. Why don't we have it yet? So I think that's a really interesting question. And this is one I got recently, which completely stumped me, which is what about emit and broadcast? So what about the eventing properties that we had in AngularJS? What do we do with that in Angular land? Okay? And this is a constantly evolving talk. I've given this in a couple of meetups in London. I'm giving this in Barcelona in a couple of weeks' time. And this thing evolves over time. So if you've got anything, if you've got any questions, come speak to me afterwards, or just tweet me, right? I'd like to evolve this as time goes on. Okay. So let's start off with Scope Watch, okay? So I used to work at this company a couple of years ago. And every now and again, me and a bunch of the front-end developers just meet up again for drinks. And we always, like, the topic of the form comes up. But it's not like the form, it's the form, right? So we sit down, we're having a couple of drinks, and eventually it's like, oh, do you remember the form? Yeah, I remember the form. Oh, the form was horrible. Oh, my God, the form was terrible. And okay, this application had loads of forms throughout it. But I'm talking about one specific section had a form. And the tests would sometimes pass, sometimes fail. Every day there'd be a bug, we'd fix the bug, another bug would appear, and then another bug, and we'd fix that and another bug. So we constantly had this issue with the form, okay? I'm going to try and explain. I'm sure everybody here's got like the form for their application as well. So I'm just going to explain in a simplified way some of the problems we had with this form. So we had basically nested hierarchy of controllers. And we weren't using controller as, we were like relying on scope inheritance. So this thing relied on variables being set on the scope by this thing, okay? So it was pretty ugly to begin with. And whenever these controllers are getting instantiated, they're also making asynchronous calls to the internet and then setting scope variables, which other things are depending on. So there's quite a lot going on just when these controls are getting instantiated. And then inside there are various form controls. And then, they're all bound to scope variables using ng model. And then you'd enter a value, or the user would enter a value into a form field that's bound to some variable on the scope. We'd have a scope watch, which then listens to it. Then that triggers some function which might set another variable, which then sets another value which is bound to another form field. Then that triggers another scope watch, which then sets another variable, and there's a second scope watch, which triggers another one. And then maybe we'd have another thing that's set up, and then that would, oh my God, update the same variable again. And then we'd basically, you basically got to a point where you'd enter the same values in the same order and get different results. Okay, now my physics is pretty rusty, but I'm pretty sure that's a definition of chaos theory. So I understand when people come up to me and ask me, what do I do with my scope watches? I know they're not really talking about in a very simplistic way. You're probably talking about, oh my God, I've got the form in my application. What do I do with my form? How do I get that working in Angular? And the solution is observables. Okay? This is how we solve this kind of problem in Angular. And I'm going to go a bit deeper into observables. For those of you who perhaps you already know observables or think you know observables, I'm going to go a bit deeper. And perhaps you haven't actually dealt much with observables yet, but I'm just going to go a bit deeper into observables so you know what it's all about. So to understand observables, you have to understand this concept of streams. Okay? And what is a stream? A stream is a sequence of values over time. So for instance, you can have a series of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, updating over time. You can have X and Y coordinates of mouse key presses. You can have key presses on a keyboard, so as users typing in something perhaps into a form field. Or perhaps you can even have JSON representations of an entire form. So that would be a form with a name field, and as I'm typing in each individual letter into that field, I'm getting a whole JSON object which represents that whole form. Okay? So what an observable is, or the way I describe an observable, is a blueprint for creating these streams and operations between those streams. And it's actually, what it is, it's actually called, there's an idea that's called reactive programming. So let me give you an example here. So we've got like a simple imperative function, it's called add. You pass in some values, A and B, and it returns the values of those added together. Pretty complicated function, I know. Now, in order to actually use this function, we want a variable called C. Can't see, yep. We would then create a variable called C and call the function add and add actual discrete values to it. Then later on in our application, B changes. B updates to 4. So we need to do a couple of things. A, you need some way of knowing that B actually updates to 4, okay? And then you need to know that because B has updated, you need to call this function called add and take that value and add it to C. Which, if you think about it, is actually quite a lot. It's one of those things where we don't really think about it too much as developers, because it's just so second nature, but it is actually a bit weird. You have to remember all of this stuff. And that's what we're basically doing with all these scope watches, is we're basically trying to figure out, oh, something's changed, what do I do now that something has changed? So with observables, you think about it a bit differently. Now, watch the screen. Yeah, I do good animations. So with observables, what you do, so now A, B, and C are streams. So they're sequences of values over time. Add is an operator. So what you do is you basically plumb things together. I describe it as plumbing and connecting things together. So you take the output of A and B, you pump it into the add operator, and the output of the add operator you put onto the C stream. So then when you want to do some of these kind of calculations, you just push a value onto the front of the A stream, again the B stream, and then the add operator automatically gets called, pumps out 3 and puts that onto C stream. So now when B updates, all you do is you pump the value 4 onto the B stream. Your plumbing is all set up already. You don't need to have scope watches or anything. It's just you've already set it up beforehand. So the add gets called automatically, calculates 5, and pumps that out onto stream C. And so that's kind of what we do with our scope watches in AngularJS, or when we migrate from AngularJS, is we basically use observables instead. So a form in Angular has a property called value changes, and what this is this is an observable. And in this observable, what gets pushed out is a JSON representation of the form itself. So this form has a first name and a last name field. And what's getting pushed out, into value changes is the JSON representation of that entire form. This is just like a stream. It's pushing out onto a stream. And then we have these different operators. So we have the filter operator. And that takes its input stream is what comes out of value changes. And what filter does is it only pushes out onto its stream when it returns true. So if the form is valid, only then will this push out the JSON object onto its output stream. Then we can add other operators. We've got debounce time, which is a common one which I use, which only publishes out to its stream, to its output stream, if 400 milliseconds has passed. Then we have distinct until change, another common one, which only publishes out if it detects something actually has a different value. Okay? Then you can add your own ones onto maps. You can add your own functionality here. And then you can just call subscribe to kind of activate the whole thing and do something with the form values. And while you're here, you can also call set value or patch value to update any of the form fields in the form itself. So that's basically it. That's what you do. That's how you solve this problem using, that's what you do with all your scope watches when you're migrating from AngularJS to Angular. You need to basically re-architect and rethink your problem in terms of observables. All right, that's scope watch. I spent a long time on scope watches, but we'll speed through the rest. So another one that I think is quite interesting is, where are all the third-party Angular modules? I remember when I started working on AngularJS, I can't even remember, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6, I don't know. There weren't really that many third-party Angular modules. You had to build your own. Only when enough third-party Angular modules were created did AngularJS really become useful and really become popular. Okay, that's because you ended up having. This is one of my clients' applications. You just ended up basically dropping in all kinds of Angular modules, AngularJS modules into your application. Each one of these would just be adding a ton of functionality, and it really sped up the development process. So when a lot of people kind of look at their AngularJS application and start thinking, how do I migrate this to Angular? Like one common question which comes up is like, well, what do I do with all of these third-party Angular modules? I'm not seeing something similar, third-party AngularJS modules. I'm not seeing something similar in Angular. Sorry, my clicker's not working. So, and I think this is really interesting because when you look at a lot of what these third-party AngularJS modules were, they were just wrappers around vanilla JavaScript libraries. Okay? There's still plenty of people doing development on the internet. There's loads of third-party modules out there, vanilla ones doing lots of functionality. If we want to use these vanilla JavaScript libraries inside our AngularJS application, we had to deal with the whole issue of scope.apply. Okay? So AngularJS only knew about stuff if it controlled it. You had to tell it when things changed so it could run the digest cycle and do interesting things like run the other scope watches or update some value on the screen. If you had a callback in your vanilla JavaScript library and that changed some value that AngularJS didn't know about, nothing would happen, nothing would update on the screen. So you had to kind of wrap things with scope.apply so that when the kind of JavaScript library callbacks completed, the AngularJS would just know to run a digest loop. So when you actually look at it, and I haven't got any stats, so I'm going to throw this number out there. I'd say about 50% of all of the AngularJS plugins and modules out there were just wrappers around vanilla JavaScript libraries, adding scope.apply, just making sure the digest cycle gets called. But in Angular land, like who's heard of Zones.js here? Okay. I think it's a really fascinating topic. I've submitted loads of calls for papers to talk about Zones.js. No conference has accepted any of them yet, so if anybody's a conference organizer and is looking at one of my papers, maybe you should have a rethink of it. I think Zones.js is incredible. It's actually going to be in discussion to become part of a native feature of JavaScript, right? It's not just an Angular-only feature. But basically, I won't go into detail, but basically what Zones.js does is it stops you from having to do scope.apply. So when you're running your hybrid application, so when you're running AngularJS and Angular in one, because Angular, the new one, uses Zones.js, it means your AngularJS application is using Zones.js. So your AngularJS application in hybrid mode, you never need to call scope.apply, okay? And because we don't need to use scope.apply, it means in Angular, you can just use the vanilla JavaScript library. This is why we don't really see a lot of third-party Angular modules, because in Angular, you just use the standard vanilla JavaScript library that everybody else is using, that the React guys are using, that the Vue guys are using. You're using the same ones, okay? And just to show you how this works, this is just a really, really simple spinner Angular component. We've got just the basic, this is the vanilla one, so it's using, you just create an instance of the spinner there. And so what you do in Angular is you basically create a template reference variable, which just identifies one node. Would you mind closing the door, please? Then you grab a reference to that using a viewChild decorator. And then all you're doing is then passing that, the DOM reference to the spin. That's all you have to do, okay? That's all we have to do in Angular in order to use a vanilla JavaScript library. No scope.apply, no nothing like that. Which then leads me to my final kind of fact for today, which is what about emit and broadcast, which is kind of our eventing technology that we had in AngularJS. So in my opinion, emit and broadcast, a significant use, if you're using emit and broadcast a lot, it's a little bit of a code smell. I'm not going to say it's bad. There's plenty of good use cases to use it. But if you're at the point where you're really struggling about what to do with your all of your emit and broadcast code in your AngularJS and how to migrate to Angular, it's usually a sign that you probably have been using it too much, okay? But the right solution in Angular land is to architect your application, use the inputs and outputs, use shared services, really kind of not rely on the emit and broadcast eventing technology. And there's no kind of similar one-to-one mapping in Angular. You can create your own. It's very, very easy to create a service which just have some sort of eventing mechanism, but it's not available built in. But there is actually an interesting solution if you do use a lot of emit and broadcast for how to handle this in the migration. So if you remember here from the slide from earlier on, I said that you can kind of rewrite something as Angular 4, and then downgrade it so it can be used in AngularJS. You can actually do the opposite, okay? You can actually take an Angular 1 service and upgrade it, okay? And then this upgraded Angular 1 service can then be used inside Angular 4. Okay, that's possible as well. Now, it's fairly straightforward. So what you'd want to do is basically you want to get a reference to root scope. So root scope is the AngularJS dependency, which you'd kind of do all the eventing on. And you basically want to make this available to your Angular application. So what we'd basically do is you create a token of root scope. Okay. We then have a factory function, which is passed in just the Angular 1 injector, and we get from there the root scope dependency. And then we create an Angular provider. So it's just a simple provider in Angular. You provided the token, you give it the use factory method, and then it's getting passed the injector, the AngularJS injector. And then all you do is you basically provide this in your ng module. And then you can just inject the root scope in your Angular application, the root scope from your AngularJS application in your Angular application. Now, eventually you have to get rid of this, right? If you want to actually get rid of AngularJS, you have to get rid of this. But if you need something during the process of migration just to give you access to that functionality, you can have it here. And I think I've done that pretty quickly, actually. I think that was it. That's the end. So.